Welcome back, everyone. Ready to dive into some fascinating stuff?
I'm ready. Always up for a deep dive.
Today, it's all about smart cities. We've got a mountain of research for this one.
Oh yeah, like what kind of stuff?
A little bit of everything, actually. Urban planning, history of tech, even some social impact studies.
Sounds like we're gonna get the full picture, not just the tech hype.
That's the goal. We want to figure out what smart cities really are, beyond the buzzwords. See what they could mean for us, good and bad.
You know, the tech is just one piece of the puzzle.
Worry, it's bigger than that.
It's how tech, cities, and people all interact, how they shape each other.
One thing that really jumped out at me from all this research, it's like cities are becoming, well, kind of sentient.
Sentient.
Yeah. Think about it. Traffic lights talking to computers miles away. Those old electric meters are now digital spies. Even security cameras are using AI to analyze faces. One source even called it hints of a newly sentient world.
Makes you think, doesn't it? But this idea of cities becoming more aware, it's not totally new.
How so?
Look back at the 1800s. The telegraph, the railroads, they completely changed how cities worked, especially the telegraph.
What was so special about the telegraph?
Information, suddenly it could travel at the speed of light, just like today's smart cities, where real-time data is king.
There's that quote, something about the railroad and telegraph being the Siamese twins of commerce. It's funny, though.
What's that?
Back then, people worried about those new technologies, too. Just like today, anxieties about jobs, disruption, the whole 9 yards. It's this constant tension between progress and fear. Like, we're always on the edge of something new and scary.
We've always been like that. Humans grappling with new tech, wondering what it means for us. That's why it's so important to look at the past, you know?
So we don't repeat the same mistakes.
Exactly. Smart cities need to be built on the lessons we've already learned.
Okay, enough high-level stuff. Let's get down to brass tacks. Buildings, for example. Those old thermostats, the ones you practically had to fight with. Well, buildings are getting a major upgrade. But here's the thing.
Uh-oh, what's the catch?
The push for building automation, it often comes from, well, crises.
Crises. Makes sense, I guess. Necessity is the mother of invention and all that.
Totally. Like in the 1970s, remember the oil embargo?
Oh, yeah.
Suddenly, everyone was obsessed with saving energy. It's like, oh, crap, we can't just keep guzzling fossil fuels forever.
It's funny how similar that was to the sudden interest in fuel-efficient cars back then.
Right. Although that interest kind of faded once gas prices went back down. The question is, will the same thing happen with building automation?
Good point. Our enthusiasm for change often fizzles out when the crisis passes.
It's like our attention span is only as long as the problem.
Speaking of buildings, though, we found this wild example in our research. Songdo, South Korea. It's like a real-life sci-fi city. Ever heard of it?
Songdo, oh yeah. The city with millions of sensors everywhere, right?
That's the one. It's mind-blowing. They call it the world's largest experiment in urban automation.
And they mean it. I read about how they track everything. Everything. Street lights that dim when no one's around, cars with RFID tags so they can monitor traffic. They even have rice cookers that talk to the power grid.
Rice cookers? Really?
No joke. It helps them optimize energy use.
Yeah.
Like the city is actually thinking and adjusting itself in real time.
It's definitely pushing the limits of what's possible, though some people argue that Songdo's too controlled. You know, too top-down.
How so?
They worry it might stifle real urban growth and create a divide between the people who can afford to live there and those who can't.
A digital divide.
Exactly. Still, you got to admit, Songdo is one heck of an experiment.
Totally. And speaking of all this high-tech stuff, it all needs power, right? Which brings us to the power grid. All those gadgets and sensors in a smart city, they suck up juice like crazy.
Yeah, that's where the smart grid comes in. It's not just about keeping the lights on. It's about making energy smarter, more efficient, more responsive.
And hopefully more sustainable, too, right?
Absolutely. We can't just keep building power plants forever.
You know, it's crazy how much electricity needs can change in a city, even within a single day. Imagine a scorching hot day in New York City.
Oh, I can only imagine.
Everyone's blasting their AC units, and the strain on the grid must be incredible. It's like a citywide energy party.
And managing that fluctuating demand, that's one of the biggest challenges of the smart grid, especially with things like electric cars becoming more popular.
Okay, I'll admit, I'm still a little fuzzy on how those smart meters actually work. You know, the ones they're installing everywhere.
They're basically like the digital brains of the power grid.
Break it down for me.
You've got your old analog meter with a spinning dial.
You're right.
Well, a smart meter is its super smart cousin. It talks to the utility company constantly, sending data back and forth.
What kind of data?
Your energy use in real time, any outages, stuff like that. It can even do things like time-of-day pricing.
Time of day prices. Is that like electricity being cheaper at night or something?
Exactly. It could encourage people to run their dishwashers or charge their cars when demand is lower. Helps balance the load on the grid.
So it's not just about monitoring, it's about changing behavior too.
Right. And here's where it gets really interesting.
Oh.
Imagine startups that act like energy coaches. They analyze your usage, give you tips to save money.
Like a personal trainer for your electricity bill.
Exactly. Or picture social media games where you compete with your neighbors to see who can use the least energy.
That's actually pretty cool. A little friendly competition for the planet. I'm into it. Like
Yeah.
those fitness trackers that let you compete with your friends, but for saving energy.
Exactly. Using tech to make sustainability more engaging, more fun.
Okay, so smarter buildings, a more dynamic grid. But what about the internet itself? The way we connect to it all has changed drastically, right? From being chained to wires to this amazing freedom of wireless.
Absolutely. That shift from wired to wireless has been massive. It's the foundation of the whole smart city idea.
But even the language we use feels outdated. Wireless. It's not magic. There's all this infrastructure behind it.
You're right. It's like those old sci-fi movies where they thought we'd all be flying cars by now.
Haha, yeah. But seriously, maybe we need a better term for this ubiquitous connectivity.
Maybe.
Mm-hmm.
What matters is that we understand this shift from fixed connections to something way more fluid, more mobile. It changes everything about how we experience the city.
I was surprised to learn about the limits of mobile bandwidth in cities, though. I thought with 5G and all, everything was blazing fast.
5G is a leap forward, no doubt, but cities are packed with devices and people. It can create serious bottlenecks.
So what do? Hit a wall? Or are there ways to innovate around these limitations?
That's the big question. Do we need even more radical new wireless tech? Or do we get creative with local solutions, public Wi-Fi, mesh networks? Who knows what else we'll come up with?
It's both exciting and a little daunting. Even with all the hype about virtual reality and the metaverse, it seems like mobile networks are still the backbone of the smart city.
And those smartphones in our pockets. They're becoming extensions of ourselves, our portals to the city, both physical and digital.
That's a great way to put it. But all this connectivity, it creates a ton of data. It's mind-boggling how much information is flowing through our cities. You know what blew me away? How far back the roots of this data collection actually go.
Are you talking about the 1890 U.S. Census and Herman Hollerith?
Yes, that story about how they were struggling to count all the people.
It's amazing, right? A simple problem of counting leads to this huge technological leap. The population was booming. The census was taking forever to process by hand.
Can you imagine counting millions of people manually?
It was a logistical nightmare. But then Hollerith came along with his punch card tabulating machine. Used electricity to read and sort those cards, sped up the whole process.
It's incredible how such a simple thing, a punch card, could have such a huge impact. It revolutionized how we process data. It even led to the creation of IBM.
It's a classic example of how a very specific problem can spark a whole new industry.
It's like those ripples spreading out, changing the world in ways you never expect. And now, fast forward to today, cities like Rio de Janeiro are using IBM's technology to create these mirror worlds, like something out of a sci-fi movie.
Mirror worlds.
They're like digital twins of the city, Super detailed models that let them visualize all the urban systems. They're using it for everything from managing traffic to coordinating emergency response.
I saw that TED Talk by the mayor of Rio.
The one where he shows how he can basically control the entire city from these digital dashboards.
Yeah, impressive, but also a bit unnerving. All that power concentrated in one place
Yeah.
makes you wonder, doesn't it?
About the potential for misuse.
Exactly. Could these systems be used to manipulate people? Or make inequality even worse?
Right. Powerful tools can be used for good or bad. We have to be really careful. And that brings up another big question. Prediction. With all this data, can we start to predict the future of cities?
That's a question that's been around for a long time. David Gelernter, the guy who actually coined the term mirror world, he had some interesting thoughts on this.
What were his thoughts?
He saw the potential of these systems, but he also worried about the risks. He warned that we could become too reliant on them, like slaves to the predictions.
Losing sight of the human element.
Exactly. And there's this long history of failed attempts to predict and control cities, Remember those urban simulations they were so excited about back in the 1960s?
Oh, yeah. They thought they could build these super complex computer models that could predict everything. Crime, traffic, everything.
But it turns out cities are just too messy, too unpredictable to capture in a computer program.
Right. They ended up with policies and urban renewal projects that backfired spectacularly.
It's a cautionary tale. Even with all our data and fancy algorithms, we still have a lot to learn about how cities work.
A little humility goes a long way. We're great at collecting data, but understanding it, using it wisely, that's the real challenge.
Couldn't agree more.
Okay, so we've talked about this top-down approach, the one championed by big tech companies, but our research also highlights a totally different way of thinking about smart cities.
Oh yeah, tell me more.
It's a bottom-up, community-driven movement, and it actually takes us back to the 1970s.
The 1970s, what happened then?
Imagine this. The first portable camcorder, the Sony Portapack, hits the scene, and a woman named Red Burns picks one up.
Red Burns.
She was a visionary. She saw the potential of video to democratize media.
Democratize media.
Yeah. She launched this movement called community video, setting up public access TV stations, teaching people how to use this new tool.
So ordinary people could tell their own stories.
Exactly. It was all about giving people a voice, especially those who were often ignored or marginalized.
Sounds a lot like the maker movement today.
That DIY spirit, using tech to empower communities, it's a powerful idea.
And it's not just about making cool videos, it's about using technology to solve real problems,
Yeah.
at the grassroots level.
Absolutely. And that brings us to another tech hero, Dennis Crowley. Remember Dodgeball?
Dodgeball. Wasn't that an early social networking app?
You got it. And Crowley was one of the guys behind it. He was fascinated by how mobile phones could connect people in real time.
Like a digital layer on top of the city.
Exactly. He wasn't just building apps, he was trying to make cities more fun, more social.
And Dodgeball eventually turned into Foursquare, right?
Yep. Crowley's focus was always on the social side of tech, how it can make cities more vibrant and exciting.
He saw the city as a giant playground, a place to explore and connect with others.
Exactly. So community video in the 70s, Dodgeball and Foursquare taking off in the 2000s, it feels like there's this growing movement to make cities more connected and engaging.
A movement driven by people, not just corporations or governments.
And DIY City is right at the forefront of this movement. Their mission is to make cities more like the internet, open, participatory, constantly evolving.
I like their thinking. A city that's constantly being shaped and reshaped by its citizens.
They run these challenges to encourage people to create cool new apps and solutions for urban problems.
Like that DIY traffic app that used crowdsourced data to help people navigate traffic jams.
That's the one. It's all about citizen engagement and open data, making cities better from the ground up.
It's a really inspiring approach. Gives you hope that we can build a better future for our cities, one that benefits everyone.
It's a good reminder that we're not just passive consumers of technology. We can be creators, innovators, change makers.
Absolutely. Technology can be a powerful tool for good, but we have to use it wisely.
Well said. Okay, we've covered a lot of ground in this first part of our deep dive. From sentient cities and smart buildings to the evolution of the internet and the power of community-driven innovation, it's a lot to take in. What are some of the key takeaways that have resonated with you so far? What are your initial thoughts on this whole smart city thing?
I'm still processing it all, but
Yeah.
it's clear that smart cities are much more complex than I initially thought.
Same here. It's not just about the technology itself, it's about how we choose to use it. It's about making sure that these advancements benefit everyone, not just a select few. It's about shaping our cities in a way that enhances human connection and makes urban life more fulfilling.
Absolutely. There's a lot of potential for good, but also a lot of potential for things to go wrong if we're not careful.
Exactly. We have to be mindful of the risks, but also optimistic about the possibilities. And that's what we're going to explore in more detail in the next part of our deep dive.
So before we took a break, we were talking about how tech can make cities more connected, more engaging. But we got to remember, it's not just about the gadgets, right?
Right. Smart cities have to be for people, not just for data points. What's the point of all this tech if it's not making our lives better, helping us connect with each other, making cities more enjoyable? It can't just be about efficiency. There's got to be a human element, too.
Exactly. It's about using tech to strengthen those social bonds, create a sense of community, make the whole urban experience more equitable.
But how do you measure something like social connectivity? It's not as simple as tracking traffic flow or energy use.
That's where things get really interesting. Our research dives into some studies using, get this, telephone call patterns to understand social dynamics between cities.
Wait, what? Telephone calls? That's pretty old school. How does that work?
Well, back in the 60s, there was this geographer, Gene Gottman. He was analyzing phone call data for cities along the Northeast Corridor.
The Northeast Corridor, that's like Boston to Washington, right?
Yep. And he noticed these cities weren't just isolated bubbles. They were operating as one giant interconnected system. He called it megalopolis.
So like a giant urban hive mind, all connected by phone lines.
You could say that. And by looking at those call patterns, Gottman could see how cities like New York and D.C. were influencing smaller cities around them. It was all about information flow, power dynamics.
They were using data to map those invisible connections even back then. That's fascinating.
And then, in the 80s, a researcher named Mitchell Moss took it a step further. He looked at global phone call data and found that institutions like Wall Street banks, media companies in New York, they were using telecom to project their power worldwide.
So they're building these global networks of influence through phone lines. It makes you wonder what those maps look like today with the internet.
Right. It shows how technology can connect us, but also control us. It can centralize power or it can distribute it. It all depends on who's wielding it.
Okay, so that's on a city level. But what about social connections between individuals? How's tech changing the way we interact with each other in the everyday life of the city?
Well, think about platforms like Meetup and Foursquare. They're all about helping people find others who share their interests, build communities around those shared passions.
Oh, yeah, Meetup. I know people who swear by it. They're in like a dozen different groups, everything from hiking to board games to coding.
It's a great example of how technology can help us break out of our little social bubbles, connect with people we might never have met otherwise, especially in these big anonymous cities.
It's like an antidote to loneliness.
Exactly. And Foursquare, it's become so much more than just checking in at places. It's about discovering new spots, getting recommendations, even building a social reputation based on your tastes and experiences.
It's like a personalized guide to the city, curated by people you actually trust.
Right. But all this connecting, exploring, can smart city tech also help with bigger societal challenges, like poverty and inequality?
That's a huge question.
That's where ICT4D comes in. It stands for Information and Communication Technologies for Development.
ICT4D. Okay, got to remember that one. So what is it exactly?
It's a whole field dedicated to figuring out how technology can be used to tackle poverty, improve healthcare and education, empower communities that are often left behind.
Sounds like important work, but I bet it's complicated.
It is. There's a lot of debate about the best approach. Some believe in top-down solutions where governments and big organizations implement these grand tech projects.
Makes sense, but wouldn't that be tough to get right?
Yeah, it can be tricky. You can't just throw technology at a problem and expect it to magically disappear.
You need to understand the local context, the culture, the needs of the people you're trying to help.
Exactly. One of our sources talked about Moldova's e-transformation project.
Moldova?
Tiny country in Eastern Europe. The World Bank got involved. They wanted to put all government services online, create a modern digital infrastructure.
That's ambitious. Did it work?
It's still a work in progress, but it shows how tech can be a catalyst for change. But it also highlights the challenges of these big projects, especially in countries that are still developing.
It's a reminder that there's no magic bullet, no one-size-fits-all solution, and we got to be mindful of the digital divide, right?
Absolutely. That gap between the haves and the have-nots when it comes to technology. We can't let smart cities become exclusive clubs for the tech elite.
Right. Everyone deserves a chance to benefit from these advancements. Otherwise, we just end up widening the gap.
Couldn't agree more.
Okay, so we've talked about some of the upsides, the potential for good. But let's get real for a second. What about the things that could go wrong? What should we be worried about when it comes to smart cities?
Well, one of the big ones is data security and privacy. All these sensors, cameras, they're generating mountains of data about us. Where does it all go? Who has access to it? How's it being used?
It is kind of creepy, isn't it? The thought of all our data floating around out there being analyzed and used in ways we might not even know about.
It's not just about government snooping on us. Even seemingly harmless apps can collect and share our data in ways that might surprise us.
So we need to be more aware of the data trails we leave behind.
Absolutely. And data security is just one piece of the puzzle. What about the reliability of the infrastructure itself? Smart cities are basically these giant interconnected systems. What happens when those systems fail?
Right. It seems like one glitch could cause a domino effect.
That's the problem with brittle infrastructure. There's this myth that the internet is indestructible. Like it can survive a nuclear attack.
Wait, really? I always thought the internet was this decentralized network that could handle anything.
It was designed with decentralization in mind, but it's become more centralized over time. A lot of traffic flows through a relatively small number of hubs and data centers.
So it's like a house of cards, one wrong move, and the whole thing comes crashing down.
Kind of, yeah.
Hmm.
And that makes the internet, and by extension, all the smart city systems that rely on it, more vulnerable to outages, attacks, all sorts of disruptions.
Okay, that's unsettling. What kind of disruptions are we talking about? Give me an example.
Remember that Amazon Web Services outage back in 2011?
Vaguely. What happened?
Thousands of websites went down for days, all because of one tiny configuration error in a data center.
Wow. So one little mistake can take out a huge chunk of the internet.
It can. Yeah. And as we move more and more critical infrastructure online, power grids, transportation systems, financial networks, those risks just keep getting bigger.
Okay, so outages are one thing. But what about deliberate attacks? Cyber terrorism, cyber warfare, that's some scary stuff.
It's a growing concern, no doubt. Our sources highlight the Stuxnet virus, this sophisticated malware that targeted Iran's nuclear program back in 2010.
Stuxnet. Yeah, that was a big deal, wasn't it?
It showed just how vulnerable critical infrastructure can be to these kinds of attacks. If a virus can cripple a nuclear program, imagine what it could do to a smart city. It's a wake-up call.
Yeah, it doesn't take much imagination to see how that could go very, very badly.
We need to be thinking about these risks now, developing strategies to protect ourselves. We can't wait for disaster to strike before we act.
Okay, so data breaches, outages, cyber attacks, we're painting a pretty bleak picture here.
Yeah.
But you mentioned surveillance earlier, and that's the one that really gets under my skin.
Big Brother, watching your every move.
Exactly. It's straight out of a dystopian novel.
It's a real concern, no doubt. One of our sources put it bluntly. The smart city will be the ultimate setup for surveillance. All those sensors, cameras, it's not hard to imagine how it could happen.
Are we headed for a future where every step we take, every purchase, every conversation is tracked and monitored? That's pretty terrifying.
It's a slippery slope. And it's not just about government surveillance. Corporations are using data to track our behavior, target advertising. We need to be more aware of how our data is being used, demand more transparency and accountability.
It's like we're constantly trading privacy for convenience. We want all these cool gadgets and services, but they come at a cost.
There's always a trade-off, and we need to make informed choices about what we're willing to give up.
Okay, so we've talked about some pretty heavy downsides. Data security, brittle infrastructure, the potential for pervasive surveillance. It can feel overwhelming, but is there a way to do this right? Can we build smart cities that are actually smarter, safer, more equitable?
That's the million-dollar question. And the good news is, our sources offer some hopeful insights.
Okay, I'm ready for some good news. Give me some solutions.
Well, first things first, we have to acknowledge the risks. We can't just pretend they don't exist. We need to plan for them, build in redundancies, backup systems, fail-safes.
So like having a plan B and a plan C, don't put all your eggs in one basket.
Exactly. Smart city systems need to be able to gracefully degrade.
Gracefully degrade.
Yeah, even if one part fails, the whole system shouldn't collapse. Our sources mentioned that story about the smart toilet that wouldn't flush because the sensor malfunctioned.
Yeah. The toilet that outsmarted itself.
It's funny, but it illustrates a serious point. We need to design these technologies to be robust, even when things go wrong. Sometimes a low-tech solution is the best backup plan.
Right. We don't want to become so dependent on sensors and algorithms that we can't function when they inevitably fail.
Absolutely.
So robustness, redundancy, fail-safes. Got it. What else? How do we make these smart cities more equitable, more human-centered?
One of the most important things is citizen involvement. People need to be part of the design process, not just passive recipients of technology.
It's like if you've had a say in how something is created, you're more likely to trust it, use it, right?
Exactly. And when citizens are involved, they can spot potential problems that tech experts and policymakers might miss.
It's about bringing diverse voices to the table, making sure everyone feels heard.
Right. One of our sources pointed to the work of Christopher Alexander, this architect and urban planner. He came up with this concept called pattern language.
Pattern language.
He believed that good design starts with understanding human behavior. He created a whole catalog of design patterns that could be used to make cities more livable, more human-centered.
So it's like a set of guidelines for building cities that actually work for the people who live in them.
Exactly. His ideas are becoming really relevant in this age of smart cities. We need to think about how to integrate technology in a way that enhances human well-being, not just for efficiency's sake.
Designed for people, not just data.
Right. And it's not just about physical design, it's about the digital infrastructure too. There's all this talk about creating a single urban operating system to manage a smart city.
An urban operating system sounds like something out of Tron.
It does, doesn't it? But some companies are actually trying to build these systems. It could have benefits, making everything more efficient, but it also raises concerns about control.
Oh, yeah, I see what you mean. If one company controls the operating system, they basically control the city.
Exactly. We don't want to repeat the mistakes of the past. We need to promote competition, openness.
Right. We need to make sure the digital infrastructure serves the people, not just a handful of powerful corporations.
Couldn't agree more. And transparency is key. We need to know how these technologies work, what data is being collected, how decisions are being made. We can't just blindly trust the algorithms.
Transparency is so important.
But it's tough. A lot of cities are reluctant to share the source code for their smart city systems. They cite security concerns or intellectual property.
But how can we hold them accountable if we don't know how these systems work?
It's a real dilemma, and one we need to address through legislation, public pressure, a commitment to open source principles.
Okay, so transparency, open source, citizen engagement, all good things. But what about the people who are already the most vulnerable? How do we make sure these technologies don't just make inequality worse?
That's a crucial question. We have to be hyper aware of the digital divide and make sure everyone has equal access.
Because it's so easy for technology to amplify existing inequalities. If you don't have a smartphone, reliable internet, you're basically shut out of a lot of the smart city experience.
Exactly. And it's not just about access. It's about how these technologies are used.
Hmm.
Are they designed to benefit everyone, or are they primarily serving the wealthy and privileged?
It's like they say, technology itself isn't good or bad. It's all about how we choose to use it.
Well said. And our research actually offers some inspiring examples of how technology is being used to empower marginalized communities. Ever heard of the Map Kibera project? It's in Kibera, one of the largest slums in Africa. It often gets portrayed as a place of poverty and despair. But a group of activists decided to use open-source mapping tools to create a more accurate, more nuanced view of their community.
So they're taking control of the narrative, showing the world a different side of Kibera.
Exactly. They're mapping resources, tracking infrastructure projects, even monitoring election violence. It's an amazing example of how technology can challenge those official narratives and give a voice to the voiceless.
I love that. They're using technology to fight for social justice, create positive change from the ground up.
They are. And they've inspired similar projects in slums and informal settlements all over the world. It's a powerful reminder that technology can be a force for good.
Okay, we've covered some pretty heavy stuff today. Data security, surveillance, the digital divide. But we've also seen some really inspiring examples of how communities are using tech to create positive change, build a better future. What are your thoughts on all of this? What does it mean for the future of cities?
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We've been exploring this world of smart cities, and wow, it's a lot to process. Sentient buildings, interconnected grids, potential for good, the risks. It's a wild ride. So where do we go from here? It feels like we're at a crossroads, trying to decide what path to take as we build these cities of the future.
You're right, it can be overwhelming, trying to make sense of all these complex challenges, the possibilities. One of our sources, Jeffrey West, said something that stuck with me. He said, we need to understand cities, like deeply, and be able to predict what will happen.
Deeply and predictively, I like that.
Yeah.
But can we really predict the future of cities? They're always changing, adapting, throwing us curveballs. Cities are like living organisms, that's true. Always in motion.
Yeah.
But when we study those patterns of growth, how they use resources, those social interactions, we can start to understand how they work, how they might change.
So maybe we can't predict the future perfectly, but we can see the trends, the opportunities, the risks, and use that knowledge to make smarter choices.
Exactly. And that's where data can be so valuable. But it's not just about collecting tons of data. It's knowing how to use it, how to analyze it, interpret it, make good decisions with it.
Data without understanding is just noise.
You got it. Michael Batty, an urban planner who's been studying cities for decades, he pointed out something interesting. Even with all the data we have now, we still haven't figured out some basic things about how cities work.
So we're swimming in data, but still thirsty for knowledge.
Yeah, kind of. Batty was looking at transportation data from London's Underground, the tube.
Yeah, with the Oyster cards.
Right. And he found this big difference between the number of people swiping in and the number swiping out.
Wait, people were disappearing into the tube. Sounds like a mystery.
Not quite. It